Hello, Badlands community. My name is Brian Clark, known as Jetsnome in the Discord and on social media. I wanted to put together a podcast getting a picture of what the Jets quarterback landscape will look like in 2025, especially considering the news today's Super Bowl Sunday, February 9th, that the Jets will be moving on from Aaron Rodgers. And really taking a picture of, what options are out there from a draft perspective, trade perspective, and free agency perspective. And based on the new front office we have, where there might be some connection points that might indicate where they might go. I also take a look at the reasons why the Jets might have moved on from Aaron Rodgers from a cap perspective and the cap impact that Aaron Rodgers' contract will have on the team as they make decisions going into 2025. First things first, I wanted to thank Joe for giving me a chance to put this together. Badlands team puts out great content all the time, and this didn't exactly line to a Discord show, shenanigan show, but either way, want to thank Joe for giving me a chance to put this together and share it with the community. So first things first, before we can take a look at which players are out there, it's worth taking a look at the new front office and what connection points they do have. So with the new GM Darren Muji, being in Denver previously, from 2012 to 2021, he was a scout, and not like I'm saying he might not have had an impact on who was being decided. He wasn't making player personnel decisions, but starting in 2021, when he got promoted to the director of player personnel, they traded a sixth-round pick to get Teddy Bridgewater from the Panthers. And that's someone who's currently a potential option for the Jets now. And then in 2022, as they let Teddy go in free agency to Miami, they traded for Russell Wilson, which by all accounts was one of the worst trades for a quarterback in recent history. Giving up Drew Lock, Noah Fant, Shelby Harris, 2 firsts, 2 seconds, and a fifth for Russell Wilson, and then extending him and giving a significant contract. That didn't work out from a cost perspective, from a trade value perspective, and last year they had to take a fairly large cap hit and let him go. But in the same regards, even though that is a negative on his resume, they did draft Bo Nix with a 12th overall pick last year, and by all early indications, he was fairly successful in his rookie year. Other quarterbacks, just to mention, in case there's considerations for who might fill out the Jets roster at the the backup position potentially. He did sign Jarrett Stidham, Josh Johnson, and Brett Rippon during his time there. Could be considered options for a camp arm or maybe a third quarterback option based off of who is there. And then finally, looking at Rick Spielman, brought on as the senior advisor with over 20 years of front office experience, both in Miami and Minnesota. It's worth taking a look at who he has had connections with in the past, as he maybe guides Darren Muji and Aaron Glenn on decision making. In Miami, where he was VP of player personnel and a GM for one season, they primarily had Jay Fiedler, and not like I don't want to use that as a good example or bad example. It's just from a length for how far ago it was and the type of player Jay Fiedler was. It's hard to really get a gauge of whether that made an impact on anything. But if you look at his time in Minnesota, he balanced a combination of veteran hire, veteran free agency pickup, and first-round quarterback or younger quarterback drafting, starting with Gus Frerotte, then moving on to Brett Favre, in 2009 after he had his 1 year with the Jets. Then he took some first-round swings with Christian Ponder as a 12th overall pick, and then Teddy Bridgewater with a 32nd overall pick. Then and then eventually going back and making a longer deal with Kirk Cousins, and almost Jet, back from a few years back. So, either way, there's been but you're looking at these names, that, both Darren Muji and Rick Spielman has had connections with that are currently still playing in the league. You look at Teddy Bridgewater, who shows up, twice. You look at Kirk Cousins. These are players that I think make a lot of sense for Jets, the front office to be considering as they're going into their who can replace Aaron Rodgers' role for 2025. So, considering what happened, let's ask the question: why did the Jets let Aaron Rodgers go? And we understand there could be different discussions from a culture perspective, from a team reset perspective, but from a cap perspective, they didn't think it made a lot of sense why they didn't want to keep Aaron Rodgers past 2025. He had a 23.5 cap hit for this year. He had a $35 million team option bonus, which would have been prorated through 2029, which would have kicked in March. leading to a 2026 cap hit of $63 million. Regardless of what you wanted to do with that, that would be hit. You could split it between 2026 and 2027 with a $21 million cap hit in 26 and a $42 million cap hit in 27. But either way, that was a pretty heavy anchor to sit there with the Aaron Rodgers contract. And additionally, another consideration there was when they were making free agency decisions in 2026, that cap charge is sitting right there on their roster, which would have limited their ability to perhaps make some big swings in free agency in 2026 without having to restructure other contracts and adjust that. So there were some fairly considerable anchors and weights this contract would have had if they decided to keep him and play into that and choose that $35 team option bonus in 2025. Now, because he is gone, the Jets have two options. They can, take that $49 million cap hit all in 2025 as a one-time cut, and be a pre-June 1st cut, or they can make him a post-June 1st cut, and where it'll be a $14 million cap hit this year, and it'll be a $35 million cap hit in 2026. Whether he retires or they cut him, from a cap perspective, it's relatively the same. If he was retired, they can bring down his base salary down to the veteran minimum, shift the rest of it to a bonus, but the total numbers do not change. There might be some cap gymnastics, but if you want to think about it this way, it's either $49 million this year or some split where it's 14 this year and 35 next year. So that's the landscape as it's looking like now with regards to Aaron Rodgers and his cap situation. Looking forward then, now that the Jets have made the decision to move on, what move are they going to make? And there's three paths that you can take. You can either draft a quarterback, trade for a quarterback, or sign a quarterback through free agency. The benefits for drafting a quarterback, and this has always been the case, is cost certainty and value. If you draft a quarterback in the first or second pick, which is where Shedeur Sanders and Cam Ward are likely going early, that AAV, that annual cost for that contract, comes in at a little bit over $9 million. If the Jets were fortunate to have one of those guys slide to them at 7, the annual cost for that contract would be $6.5 million. For all these contracts, they're 4-year contracts. Generally, early in the draft, they are fully guaranteed, and the team would have the option to the choice to exercise the 5th-year option after the 3rd year, giving the team 5 years of player control without having to utilize the franchise tag. And the reason why that's a great thing is because when you have a GM on a 5-year contract, you have a coach on a 5-year contract, and then you have your new quarterback on a 5-year contract, it's good for team building and alignment, and a lot of GMs really try to push that, to have that organization structured in a way that aligns to their structure. The downside, as we're all very much aware, is that there's really only 2 top quarterbacks that could have the potential of playing in 2025. Additionally, there is a fairly high draft cost to go up to 2 or 3 or 1 to get one of these quarterbacks, and we'll be going through that in a little bit. Some prior history of trades that where that had to happen. Finally, and I know there's a lot of people online that are trying to decide between Jackson Dart and Kyle McCord and Jalen Milroe as potential later round options. I think that's a very strong consideration. I would personally do that if I was in Darren Muji's shoes. But I think it's fair to say that all of those guys are probably a year or 2 away from being ready to be put into the starter role. They're great options from a development perspective. But when we're thinking about 2025 and who's ready to start, I don't think that those quarterbacks are truly ready for this year. When you're going to the trade for a QB option, you're getting a starting caliber quarterback with experience leading an offense. You do not need to pay any signing bonus that was guaranteed to them. That's something where the acquiring team pays for the signing bonus that stays on their cap. You only have to pay the remaining base salary, any option bonuses, any workout bonuses, or any kind of performance or incentive-based bonuses, that come along with that contract. But there is some slightly lower cost with some of that, than the team that signed that initial contract with them. The downside though is these quarterbacks are older, so there's for many of the ones that are available in the market for this year, there's limited long-term benefit, and compared to a rookie or free agent, there's less of a cap benefit than for some of those other options. And then finally, you have the option of signing a free agent quarterback. This is potentially a lower cost outcome, providing longer term cap flexibility. So you could sign a quarterback for a year or 2, have them be a fix, and then without having to be a burden on that 2026 cap, especially considering the $49 million cap charge that's going to be accrued for Aaron Rodgers. Having a cheaper quarterback to offset that will have less of an overall impact on the cap and give you more flexibility to extend Quincy Williams, to give a big deal contract to Garrett Wilson and Sauce Gardner. It gives you that flexibility without, and still having feasible quarterback play at the position. Additionally, based on the number of free agents that are out there, you're actually able to target a quarterback who may have a scheme experience or background to ease the transition. So, Tanner Engstrom primarily comes from a West Coast scheme. You could assume that it'd be something similar. So you can find quarterbacks that are out there based off what's available, who's run and played in similar schemes before, which could help ease the transition, especially for a new offensive coordinator and a new coach. The downside for this is every one of these options that are there has flaws, whether it's injury concerns, consistency, or age. There's no situation where one of these free agent quarterbacks are a top of the market guy, a top 5 or top 10 quarterback, and that goes into some of the equation of why they're actually available for the Jets to consider. And the other thing that's worth considering is there are around 9 to 10 teams that need a quarterback. Where there's either some vagueness in their room currently, or there's really not an option on their roster. So even if there is a quarterback that the Jets would want, there's a potential of a bidding war because there are some limited options. Where someone like Justin Fields or someone like Sam Darnold, who teams might consider as a stronger option, they might end up going for more than what people would anticipate, strictly because the limitations for top end free agent available quarterbacks. So, looking at the drafting a quarterback option first, the rookie's looking at the contract scale first. A first overall pick gets paid $9.8 million, second $9.4, our slot $6.5. And if we want to consider, the Jets drafting a quarterback in the second, third, or fourth round, that would come in at $2.2 million for the second round, $1.4 million for the third, and $1.2 million for the fourth. Now, one key thing to note, the fifth-year option is only available for first-round picks. So if the Jets were to draft a quarterback in the second, third, or fourth, that would be a 4-year contract. Generally, those contracts are not fully guaranteed. They're guaranteed for a portion of the time. There's some other kind of considerations they can do with the build. But, one benefit here, though, is whether it's $1 or $2 million, that is still generally below the league average for a backup quarterback. Most backup quarterbacks in the league make between $2.5 million to around $5 million on the top end for a backup quarterback. So even if these guys come in, you develop them for a year, and 2-3 years down the line, you realize that they're not developing to the starter that you want, they can stay on as your backup quarterback, have that value below the average cost, and save an extra $1 to $3 million on the cap while having that guy there. But on the other side of the coin, if they develop into a starter that you can play, now you're paying $1 or $2 million for a quarterback, and based on the quality of play, that could equal to $40 to $50 million worth of cap space value you've gained in that position. Paying them only $1 or $2 million versus paying them $40 or $50 million or more against the cap for that year. So, to me, it's always worth throwing a dart, for lack of a better term, at these quarterbacks and seeing if one of them can hit, because the downside is still a well-valued backup quarterback. So I know we can talk about those other options, the McCords, the Milrose, and the Darts of the world, maybe in one of those later rounds. But if we are talking about what are the options for the Jets moving up for Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders, I want to take a look at the 3 most recent trades where a team was moving from the back end of the top 10 up, and seeing what that ended up costing those teams to do so. So most recently, it was Bryce Young, where the Panthers gave up their 9th overall pick, or swapped from the 9th to the 1 with the Bears, and gave up that 9th pick in 2023, their 2023 second. Then they gave up a first in 2024, which ended up being the first overall pick, and the 2025 second, which will be paid out this year. So it's one of those things where I'm sure if the Panthers had a crystal ball, they probably would have held on to the pick at 9, drafted in their first overall pick last year, where they would have had the option between Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, Bo Nix. There are plenty of options that they could have considered, and I think they would have been much better off, all things considered. But based on the value of the picks that they've given up, they basically paid a 4th overall pick to do that move up. That's a very, very significant cost just to do that move up. Another next player, that involved a big draft or pre-draft trade was the Niners moving up from 12-3 in 2021 to draft Trey Lance. Obviously, Trey Lance did not work out in San Francisco. And the Niners were extremely fortunate to draft Brock Purdy with the Mr. Irrelevant pick and continue their success and continue their ability to have above average quarterback play out of that position at a very low cost. It's actually because of that not only did they not get punished by Trey Lance missing out, but for the purposes of the trade, where they gave up, they also gave up their 2022 first, that ended up being the 29th overall pick. They gave up a 2022 third, which is the 102nd overall pick, and then a 2023 first, which is the 30th. So, they were very, very fortunate that their 2 firsts in their future years were the 29th and 30th overall pick, leading to a rough trade benefit going from 12-3 of only the 71st overall pick or a 3rd round pick, which from a trade up perspective was actually very, very cheap, but not because of the reasons that you would anticipate. If Trey Lance was playing as well as Brock Purdy, I think they'd feel like they got a steal out of it. But if because of the nature of how he played, I think the Niners were extremely fortunate that they were able to have a second quarterback step up and play well. And the last one, and I know Jet fans, we know this one well, is the Sam Darnold trade from 2018, where we moved up from 6-3 to draft Sam with that trade with the Colts, and giving up 3 second-round picks, 2 in 2018 and 1 in 2019, which worked out to around the 21st overall pick. I think from a trade cost perspective, that's about right. Giving up a mid to late first-round pick to move up and get your quarterback. I think this is a situation where the value and the player probably, if you look at Sam Darnold now, might make sense. But, there's still a fairly significant cost when everything goes into it. So when you're looking at this situation, people are saying, well, you might not need to give up a first-round pick, or, this is a weak class. You don't need to give up that much. At a minimum, if you look at this, you have to give up multiple firsts, or you're going to have to give up multiple firsts, or a first and multiple seconds and other picks to move up to where I think would be 2 to get ahead of the Giants. So, I know I'll be talking about this later, but in my personal opinion, despite the rumblings that the Titans might want to move on and keep Will Levis and draft another position, it's more likely that they're going to be drafting Cam Ward or Shedeur Sanders at 1. The Browns, if they aren't going to draft a quarterback, would be the spot for a trade up, because it's nearly guaranteed at this point that if one of those 2 quarterbacks are sitting there at 3, the Giants are going to take them. So if the Jets were interested in either of these 2 quarterbacks, they'd either have to move up to 1 or 2, and they'd likely have to give up at least a first, if not 2 firsts, and if not multiple other early picks or players to make that worth it. Which, based on the pedigree of these players and where people are seeing their value, doesn't seem to make a ton of sense. But moving on from drafting a quarterback option, take a look at the trade market. So I've highlighted 5 quarterbacks that I think are the most likely or most obvious trade considerations at the quarterback position, being Brock Purdy, Matt Stafford, Derek Carr, Geno Smith, and Kirk Cousins. And even with each of these, I have to caveat this by saying, in some of the cases, they're there because they are a 2026 free agent, or there's been rumblings about them potentially leaving. But in many of the cases, there's not necessarily the motivation from a cap perspective for these teams to let these players go. And in some cases, it would seem very detrimental to let them go. So, we'll talk through each of these here. The first one is Brock Purdy, and out of these, he's the best long-term option based on his age and performance. To get Brock Purdy, you're going to have to give up a first-round pick and then probably a little bit more to get him. And I know a lot of people would say, well, that's crazy. Brock Purdy's not a top 5 quarterback in the league. No, but he's a top 12 quarterback in the league. And based off of what you've seen out there, he's definitely worth. I see him very similar to Jared Goff, which is in a offense that is well constructed with weapons, he could be a high value distributor of the ball. Is he going to elevate your team similar to a Joe Burrow, Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Lamar Jackson? Definitely not. But he's already taken his team to the NFC Championship game. He's been able to prove his ability to deal and play well in high stress situations. He has value. Now, if you don't like the cost of the trade, you're probably also not going to like the cost of his contract. The estimate that I have for Brock Purdy, if on the open market, so if you were to trade for him, what an extension cost would be, I'm putting that at 5 years, $280 million, which is a $56 million AAV, and around 170 guaranteed. And I know you hear that number, you're like, there's no way Brock Purdy's worth $56 million. I wouldn't pay over $45 million for him. Well, if we take a look at the rest of the market and what other quarterbacks that are of similar ilk have gone for, it's hard to, based off Brock Purdy's performance, he's performed better than many of them. And you have to assume that he's going to make, similar or slightly more as the cap has gone up. So first, taking a look at Tua's contract, right? Tua went 4 for 212, $53 million guaranteed, $53 million a year, $167 million guaranteed. Trevor Lawrence, 5 for 275, $55 million a year, $200 million guaranteed. Jordan Love, 4 for 220, $55 million a year, $160 million guaranteed. And then the most recent contract, which I'm sure Brock Purdy's agents would be pushing for and leveraging as a benchmark, was Dak Prescott's contract from last year. 4 years, $240 million, $60 million a year contract, $231 million guaranteed. So a nearly fully guaranteed contract at $60 million a year. So when you're looking at the play of Brock Purdy, he's in that range of Tua and Trevor Lawrence and Jordan Love and Dak Prescott. All of them are getting around $55 million a year or more. And all of them are getting well over 160 or over $200 million in guarantees. So there's no way Brock Purdy's signing a $45 million 4-year contract for $100 million. That's not happening. He's not getting a Kirk Cousins deal from a few years ago or Derek Carr deal. He is going to be getting one of those top-end contracts. So if you want Brock Purdy, you have to give up a first, and you're going to have to pay him a considerable amount of money. And I think a lot of Jet fans, based on the player, regardless of his age, I think they would say that's probably a little bit too expensive. And once again, you take a look at this from the Niners' perspective, though. Why would the Niners want to do this? If you're the Niners, I personally would not even extend Brock Purdy. You have him for one more year in 2025 at around $1 to $2 million on the last year of his deal. You can franchise him in 2026, which would be around $41 million for that year. And then you could franchise him again in 2027 with the 25% penalty for a second-year franchise tag, costing around $52 to $53 million. So you can get Brock Purdy using the two franchise tags for around a 3-year, $93 million contract, $31 million a year, which is well below market value for the quality of play. You may not like Brock Purdy, but that would be making less than Geno Smith. That would be making less than pretty much every other starting quarterback that isn't a rookie. So to me, the Niners should not budge. They should not make an extension unless Brock Purdy wants to do some kind of sweet deal now to maybe get for a $46 or $47 million to get more money now. Maybe that's what he would do, but that's something that the Niners would do as a benefit for themselves, not something that the Jets will get after they make a trade. If they make the trade, he's going to want that full market value, which honestly he probably would deserve at the open market. So for all those reasons, even though Brock Purdy might be the youngest, best option of that group, I don't think he's the fit for the Jets. Then looking next at Matthew Stafford, and there's been some rumblings on whether the Rams are going to keep Matthew Stafford or not, maybe go to Jimmy Garoppolo. Obviously, there's some discussion around him being upset about Cooper Kupp potentially going. I think it would cost probably a second or third to get Matthew Stafford, considering his age. And the Jets' cap charge for him would be $27 million if he was on a team in 2025. But on top of him being the Super Bowl quarterback from just a few years ago, being a few pass plays away from the NFC Championship game, and for the fact that his dead cap hit would be $45 million in 2025 for the Rams and $22 million in 2026. It just doesn't make sense for the Rams to take a step back at the quarterback position, especially as they have been building this new young defense, to go from Matthew Stafford to Jimmy Garoppolo and pay that large dead cap hit. So I think in the end the Rams will mend fences with Matthew Stafford. He'll stay there, but I did want to mention him because if he does shake free, at least from a cap charge perspective and from a trade perspective, he wouldn't be overly costly and would be a very suitable 1-2 bridge quarterback option for the Jets. The next quarterback is Derek Carr, who is one of those hashtag almost Jets, has been there, was almost a Jet a few years ago in the same year as Aaron Rodgers. And the only reason why I'm putting him here is because if the Saints decide to do a full throw away the season rebuild and just take all their cap hits in this year and try again in 2026, if he's on the roster and he's their quarterback in 2025, it's a $51 million cap hit for Derek Carr, who's nowhere near worth that, but that's what it costs for their cap this year based off of how they've had to push money out over the past few years. But if they cut him or trade him, their dead cap hit is still $41 million. So for $10 million less, more, you could have him on the roster. So for the Saints, it makes very little sense to get rid of Derek Carr just to play, Jake Haener or Spencer Rattler and have $10 million more in cap savings. Now, if they want to punt on the year and save $10 million and just go for a first overall pick and going 1-16, sure, maybe that's how he shakes free from a cut or trade value perspective. But from his play, his injury history, his cost, I think that's one of those things where he probably will not be an option, but did want to mention him nonetheless. Another situation like this is Geno Smith. Geno Smith, he is a 2026 free agent. So, and he does have a $16 million roster bonus that is due in March. So if the Seahawks did want to say, we want to work out an extension, maybe the two sides can't come to an agreement, the Seahawks can decide to try to trade him, not have to pay that $16 million roster bonus this year, and reset with a different free agent quarterback or different traded quarterback. Now, from what you do hear, though, is that he wants to stay in Seattle. It seems like, they do like him. And just like the Jets are looking for a bridge quarterback to their future, I think Geno Smith serves as the perfect bridge quarterback for the Seahawks. So, his cap charge isn't significant. It's in the low 30s for the Seahawks. It would make a ton of sense for them just to keep him there for one more year, draft, similar to what the Jets, I would hope, would do, draft a second, third, or fourth round quarterback, and then move on from him in 2026 and have that developmental quarterback be their quarterback going forward. I also think that if Geno Smith were to have his say, he probably wouldn't want to come back to the Jets based off of the history and everything else. It's not like the fans specifically dislike him, but obviously, after he was here, years ago, I think he would want to stay away and stay moved on. The last player here, and obviously he has some connections to Rick Spielman, so it's worth calling out, but it is Kirk Cousins. Now, obviously, last year was not a great year for him. Coming off the Achilles injury, he did not play well. And by the end of the year, he was replaced by Michael Penix, and it seems fairly certain at this point that the Falcons want to move on from him. He does have a $10 million roster bonus for 2026 that goes into effect in early March. So the Falcons are likely trying to either cut or trade him in the next month, so they don't have to incur that $10 million roster bonus, which would be on the cap next year. Right now, he has a $27.5 million cap hit, so the cap hit isn't significant, but at the same time, there are those other considerations you have to take into account. Despite his play last year, if you think that maybe he needed an extra year to recover, maybe he'll be better in 2025, he is a good short-term option for a 1 to 2 year deal. And with his previous connection, could be a familiar option for the front office to bring in. Regardless, though, even with Kirk Cousins being an option there, in many cases, these guys don't seem like a true ideal situation for the Jets, considering their coaching staff, how they're going to build their team, and where they are in their hunt for a Super Bowl. I think they're probably still a few years away, and all of these seem. If you were to bring one of these on board, like Matthew Stafford or Kirk Cousins, it seems like you're trying to get a last-minute run, similar to what we did with Aaron Rodgers 2 years ago. And I just think from where the team is in their cycle, they're probably not the right fit for any of these players. Now it's time to take a look at the free agency market, and I broke up this group into 3 groups. The preferences, which are kind of the quarterbacks that a lot of Jet fans feel like could be the best options for them. The okay, I guess guys, which is, maybe ones that you would bring in to compete with Tyrod Taylor as a starting quarterback for this year, or the final group is the we punted on the season guys, and those, if we're being completely honest, those are the ones that at best would fill out a roster, but they probably aren't doing much more than that. So when I talk about these quarterbacks in general, I'm using a bridge quarterback contract as a baseline from a contract perspective. So the best example of that is what Gardner Minshew got last year. So he got a 2-year, $25 million contract, $15 million guaranteed, to come in and compete with Aiden O'Connell, but with a slight advantage, going in. That's the baseline. So obviously some guys might get that, some guys might get below that, but that's kind of like your baseline. You have the inside track contract for a free agent quarterback. So when we look at our first guy here, Justin Fields, I think he has slightly higher upside, slightly better pedigree than Gardner Minshew. He's going to be above that contract. Maybe 2 for 30, 2 for 35, with more potential based on play time and performance incentives. $15 to $20 million guaranteed is very safe to be expected, and it would be more than what he got last year, which is the last year of his rookie deal at $3.2 million. The downside is I just don't think he'll be free. The Steelers have been very open to say they're looking to bring back either Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. I think if you look at both of these players, from an age perspective, he's obviously much younger. From an upside perspective, Justin Fields still has more potential. And then I think from a cost perspective, when the Steelers are looking at this, both players are going to garner attention from multiple teams in the free agency market. And I just think that a team will more likely want to take a chance short term with Russell Wilson based off his Super Bowl pedigree and his name value than Justin Fields. And so I personally think the Steelers will be bringing back Justin Fields, and I don't think he will be free. But if for some reason the Steelers bring back Russell Wilson, I think Justin Fields will be a prime target for the Jets to take, and compete for 2025. The next quarterback would be Jameis Winston, and Jameis Winston would be my personal pick, especially in a situation where Justin Fields is no longer available. I think based on his play, his history, aligning directly with what Gardner Minshew got, which is the 2 years, $25 million, 15 guaranteed, slightly more perhaps, with incentives, but he is a highly inconsistent, high variability quarterback, but he's also a ton of fun. And last year he got 1 year, $4 million to be the backup for the Browns, and performed well when he was in there. I mean, way outperformed Deshaun Watson in that offense. And when but he's been productive in multiple systems before. He threw for 5,000 yards with Tampa Bay. He threw for 30 touchdowns and 30 interceptions. But at the same time, when you're looking at the Jets and their history, one of our most you don't necessarily need to be perfect and always driving efficient game plan to have a good season. One of our most fun seasons was probably our last fun season, which was 2015, where we had a high variability quarterback in Ryan Fitzpatrick come in and set Jet records. I can see Jameis, you flip a coin a bunch of times, he can have a bunch of great games, and all of a sudden a season that might look like 6 or 7 wins can turn into a 10-win season and a ton of fun. After the Adam Gase, offensive seasons and some of the seasons we had with Zach Wilson, having a fun season from an offensive perspective, even if it might lead to some pick sixes and turnovers, would just be great, especially in a situation where Justin Fields may not be available. The next quarterback is Sam Darnold, and I think Sam Darnold will be the first chip to fall when it comes to free agency. He has the highest potential from an age perspective, and he proved himself last year to be a very competent quarterback, with a great season. I think the downside is I don't think he's ever going to hit the market. If you're the Minnesota Vikings coming off a 14-win season, you don't take chances at the quarterback position. You have J.J. McCarthy there, but if you bring back Sam Darnold on the franchise tag 1 year, you can make two determinations. One, you can find out if he's, you can have resiliency in your quarterback room with 2 quarterbacks to drive the team forward in case there's an injury. And if Sam goes out and balls out again in 2025, you can extend him and you can, make him your long-term quarterback, trade away J.J. McCarthy, who will also have 3 years of rookie contract control for that team, so you can still likely get a first-round pick for him, and you have your long-term solution. The Vikings walking away from Sam Darnold doesn't make a ton of sense. But what if he was, released as a free agent, or if they tagged him and decided to trade him, and then the other, with the contingency that the other team would extend him, I can see Sam Darnold getting something similar to what Kirk Cousins got last year from the Falcons. Kirk got 4 for 45 a year and around $100 million guaranteed. I think Sam, just because he hasn't been as consistent, might get a slight downgrade from that. But 4 years, $42 million a year, $168 million total, $90 million guaranteed. That's very much in line, with a slight bump off the Daniel Jones contract, which makes a bunch of sense based off of Sam's history, his draft pedigree, but also his performance from last year. So being a 2-year upgrade, after it was made for the Daniel Jones contract, a slight downgrade from Kirk Cousins, I think that's about right for Sam Darnold. And if he does shake free, I do not think he will come to the Jets. It makes a lot of sense for him to not, based off of his experience and prior history. But at worst, if he does shake free and go to another team that isn't the Vikings, that would reduce the pool of teams that are looking for a quarterback to have one available. And the final quarterback in this preferences group is Russell Wilson. And obviously he has Super Bowl winning pedigree. He's a veteran with a lot of experience. And last year in Pittsburgh, he wasn't that bad. I know he had some pretty rough years in Denver, and his last couple years in Seattle had some challenges. But in Pittsburgh last year, he was fairly efficient. And despite his age, he still is able to throw throw a deep ball well, and has purpose, I guess, for a team that's coming on board, especially a team that's looking to make the playoffs with a more well-rounded roster. I do not think that he would be getting some kind of basic bridge quarterback contract, but where I see his contract aligning is kind of like in alignment with the Jets gave Aaron Rodgers, in alignment with what the Saints gave Derek Carr, but with a slight bump because of the increase in cap. So 2 years, $75 million, $65 guaranteed is kind of like the low end. Could go slightly over $40 million a year. He only is 37 years old, so he only has 1 to 2 years left. But I think that he, for a team that is looking for a short-term fix, that I think he'd be a solid option, especially considering the pool of other quarterbacks that are available and their pedigree. So after this group of preferences, you do have the next group, and this next group isn't, I said, the best options, but I think each of these can come in and at worst compete with Tyrod Taylor and be a competent second quarterback in the room. Not with Tyrod Taylor's injury history, having a second quarterback that you can trust to start games wouldn't be bad. And my first quarterback that's here and would be my preference of this group is Jimmy Garoppolo. And last year he got a fully guaranteed backup contract money with the Rams, $3.2 million. I think you can bring him in for $6 to $8 million, which is on a 1-year deal, which is above the backup the backup money Tyrod's making $5 a year. And it wouldn't be unrealistic that with Jimmy G's injury history, with Tyrod's injury history, is it possible with the two quarterbacks combined, you can piece together 17 games? Jimmy G played primarily in a West Coast system, something that Tanner Engstrom will play. I think there's a logical fit there from a play style perspective. From an experience perspective, he did go to Super Bowl. He did play multiple playoff games. He's not, unaware of being able to survive. So I think if you're looking for an experienced veteran fit, I think he's a fair, cheap, and you can at least expect league average quarterback play. If for nothing else, but at a lower cost, which is great. The next one's interesting. It's Cooper Rush. And Cooper Rush obviously has been the backup in Dallas for the last few years and has played multiple times in the past few years. I think he's actually another interesting candidate just because of his consistent play. Last year he had 8 starts, and played 12 games in total, but threw for 1,800 yards, 12 touchdowns, 5 picks, and he won games for the Cowboys with a fairly diminished receiving core. He didn't have a ton of weapons, but he played consistent, controlled the ball, and when you think about can your backup quarterback go in there and win games for you and go 500, or get a couple wins, I think Cooper Rush is more than capable of that, and has proven that in multiple years. Do I think that he's going to be a front runner, to be the starter if he were to come in? No, but he would be a true competition quarterback with Tyrod Taylor, and based on performance, he could beat out Tyrod in camp. But if not, he's already proven to be able to come in as a backup and win games in case Tyrod were to get hurt. The next one is not someone who I would prefer for the Jets, but I am mentioning it, is Daniel Jones. And I think Daniel Jones, just after his playing with New York the last few years, just needs a reset year. He needs to do the route of Baker Mayfield or Sam Darnold and go, sit on the bench, be on a quarterback that's established, in an offense that's established, and just reset his mechanics, reset his mindset, and get, kind of like wash the bad taste, that his name has for a lot of other teams, and consider and try to go for a starting role in 2026. Last year, he had his the final, the second year of his 4 for 160 contract. I think for him, based on his experience, if he was to be the second quarterback for a rookie or something like that, I can see him getting in the 1 year, $8 to $10 million range, because he does have prior starter experience, because he is younger. But I just don't think for him and our situation, he's not a West Coast type quarterback. I don't think he's the right fit for us. But there could be a situation where he could be a competing quarterback in another room for a team. And the final quarterback I had to put here was Teddy Bridgewater. And as we mentioned previously, he was traded. Darren Muji traded for him in Denver and made him a starting quarterback. Rick Spielman drafted him in Minnesota. And then when you think about from a familiarity perspective, he was in the locker room with the Lions last year. So Aaron Glenn's familiar with him. Tanner Engstrom's familiar with him. All the other coaches that came across from Detroit, are familiar with him. And separately, he's familiar with the scheme. He's familiar with the verbiage. He's familiar with everything with these coaches. He's 32 years old. Yes, he's not off winning a high school championship like he did last year. But he has the option to come in here and truly compete with Tyrod for that role. I think coming in at $5 million, that is in line with Tyrod's contract, makes a ton of sense. He's been in this locker room before, when he was with the Jets a few years back, and I just think when you see so many of these connection points and you see the familiarity, this might be an area where the coach says, you know what, let's just keep things simple and not having variance at the quarterback position, and having someone that you might trust to run the offense, be aware of the offense, maybe help, steady the ship, and within the locker room, within that coaching staff as well, and provide an extra layer of support. I think could make a ton of sense, bringing in a veteran quarterback like him. So, my preference would be Jimmy G out of this group, but I can see, a few different options making sense here. And the final group here is just, we punted on the season. And I think if we're doing this, it's because, we truly didn't evaluate the other quarterbacks similarly, and maybe they see some value here at a much lower cost. But more likely than not, if these guys are playing any games for us during the year, it means that we've had multiple injuries, and we're just not truly competing for a playoff run in 2025. The quarterbacks I included here were Jacoby Brissett, Jarrett Stidham, Marcus Mariota, and Mac Jones. I just think that, and Mac Jones I want nowhere near the green and white. Just not a fan of his play whatsoever. But these guys are going to be making true backup money, $2 to $3 million a year. And maybe they round out the room. Maybe they can come in as a third quarterback situation. But I don't see them as a fit for a 2025 starting role for the New York Jets. So when you kind of take all these together, when you take the draft options, the trade options, and the free agency options, what I want to do is I want to take a look at the 9 to 10 teams that have that, I'll say, gray area look at the quarterback position in 2025, and really see where I think that each of these guys will land based off where the team is and what makes sense based off of their considerations. So for the Cleveland Browns, Deshaun Watson was their quarterback in 2025. Tore his Achilles, re-injured his re-aggravated his Achilles injury, probably out for 2025. I think this is the perfect landing spot for Kirk Cousins. Whether it be a trade or cut. If he's cut by the Falcons, he can sign for the veteran minimum with Cleveland and that would greatly help their cap situation. If they trade for him, they can always trade for him with some other cap, considerations and payments as well, which would help because Sean Watson's cap hit is massive for this year. But when you look at that team, they have a great defense. Kevin Stefanski might be, on his last year if he doesn't have a good season. There'll be a sense of urgency to bring in a quarterback and be successful now. And I think Kirk Cousins, with his time window, it just aligns great for him to come on board and serve as the bridge for new quarterback options in 2026 or beyond. For the Colts, I want to put them here, not because I don't think Anthony Richardson's going to be the starter. I do. I think he'll be the starter again next year. But when you look at his injury history, when you look at his mental fortitude and some of the questions coming out of that locker room, I don't see the Colts, rolling out a lower end backup as their secondary option. So this might be a place where Jameis Winston, for example, gets paid some more money to be a higher paid backup and goes there instead of being a free agent option. Or maybe Teddy Bridgewater might have been a preference for the Jets, or Jimmy Garoppolo will be a preference for the Jets, but he goes there to be a stronger backup option with the potential to play. So I want to include the Colts strictly as a team that is likely going to take a higher end option, which could change the other free agency available players for the Jets. Next is the Raiders. They have Gardner Minshew as their quarterback last year and Aidan O'Connell for a good chunk of the season. Neither worked out. But obviously, them sitting at 6, they likely also will not get one of those rookie quarterbacks, sliding to them. I think this is the landing spot for Russell Wilson. I think Wilson will not be retained by the Steelers. And when he's looking at his landscape, so it's not a matter of what the Jets want, but when he's looking at his teams and like, well, would I prefer going to the Jets? Would I prefer going to the Raiders? To the Browns potentially? I just see his familiarity with Pete Carroll and the limited other options that make sense for where that team is. I think he's going to want to choose the Raiders as his landing spot. It just makes a ton of sense for that. I don't think he would want to come to New York, but that's my guess for that, and it would make sense for him to have that reconnection with Carroll. As I mentioned previously, I think Sam Darnold will stay with the Vikings on the franchise tag. It doesn't make sense for them to roll the dice at the quarterback position when the rest of their team is great. I think the Saints, as I mentioned before, from a cap perspective, it makes no sense to move on from Derek Carr. If it's $10 million more to keep him than not, just keep him, bite the bullet from a cap perspective and try to, figure out how to put a team together on the field this year. For the Giants, despite their winning ways at the end of the season last year, I think that they will draft Shedeur Sanders at 3. I think that's the quarterback that will land to them. And they'll try to rebuild, what has been a real rough run for them over the last few years. For the Jets, obviously Aaron Rodgers was a quarterback last year. I think he retires. I just think that when he sees the landscape of teams, I think he'll be making that call based off of that relative. A lot of teams not wanting to take on the circus that comes along with him. But I think this is the landing spot for Jameis Winston just based off of how other chips have fallen. I would love it, but I would also keep open the idea of one of those other quarterbacks like Bridgewater or Garoppolo if Winston doesn't seem like the right fit. But when you look at him down in Super Bowl week, getting involved with the media, he might want to come to New York too to continue that, let's call it, potential post-playing career path. And to be honest, if you want to think about who's the current day Ryan Fitzpatrick, it's Jameis Winston. We had our fun year with Fitzpatrick in 2015. He's now on his, he has his post-game, stuff with Amazon. I think Jameis can align very well to that same path and really use Fitzpatrick as that benchmark plan. As I mentioned before, I think the Steelers will retain Justin Fields. I think from a youth perspective, from a contract cost perspective compared to Russell Wilson, I think he'll just come in cheaper, and he has more upside if Arthur Smith's able to figure him out and take advantage of his athletic ability. And he wasn't a horrific thrower last year. It was a lot of one reads, but he was effective as a quarterback, very middle of the road. I think there's a chance, for him to at least maintain being an average quarterback for Pittsburgh in the future. And the last two teams, the Seahawks, I think, they're going to keep Geno Smith, use Geno Smith as their bridge quarterback for either a mid-round pick this year or a pick in 2026 to get them to their next, the next stage of quarterback play. And I think the Titans aren't going to roll out Will Levis again with the first overall pick. They're going to take Cam Ward. Their coach, aligning their GM and their coach with this with a new quarterback so they can reset what has been a fairly rough couple of years in Tennessee. So overall, the Jets landscape is interesting. Now that Aaron Rodgers is gone, it's one of those things where, at least you're going outside the locker room, to bring someone in and either compete with Tyrod or be a serviceable backup in case, of an injury with Tyrod. But either way, I just hope that the Jets quarterback carousel stops at a place that allows them to reset, potentially develop a young quarterback, whether, Jordan Travis or a drafted quarterback this year, and get us in the right spot for 2026 and going forward. Again, thanks to everyone, Badlands community for giving me the platform to do this. Discord's been amazing, and obviously thanks Joe for giving me a chance to put this together. If you want to find me, I'm in the Discord, I'm on Twitter and everything else at JetsKnown. If you want to see me in person, I'll be at the live show in New York. You can buy me a beer, I can buy you a beer, or it doesn't matter because it's an open bar, but we will gladly, I'll gladly enjoy, having a few beers with whoever's there. And, if not, I appreciate you taking some time to learn a little bit, and we will, I guess, hopefully be in touch somewhere along the lines. Thanks again, everyone, and let's go Jets.